So again, I'm just going to switch over to Unsplash so you guys can see that. I just found paper texture. I think I just typed in charcoal paper and found one that fit in with this process. You could type in paper texture. You can make your own texture and just take a picture of it. So if you wanted to add in texture for those things, that's totally fine to do. You could just, take some charcoal or, I don't know, some burnt wood from the fireplace and draw on some paper, and then you can kind of take a picture of that to scan it in. Photographs are fine for texture. It doesn't have to be very photorealistic for it to work this way. So I just downloaded this picture. This is stock photo kind of space, but it's royalty free all the time, which is great. So highly recommend Unsplash. And then I'm just going to drop that into my project file into After Effects. So let me do this process one more time. So here's the picture that I dropped in. It's just drag and drop that JPEG file into this project section, and then just drag and drop it onto my timeline to add it in. Now this is going to be too big, right? So I need to scale it down so we can get a little bit more of the texture, or paper grain wouldn't be terrible to include. That'd be kind of fun. So as we do this, I'm going to go ahead and shrink that and then zoom in. And I just held Shift as I was scaling it down to include it. Now, if I open the drop-down menu, I want to be able to change the blending mode on this. The blending mode is one where I can kind of make sure that it fits in with the space. I'm making sure that it's got like kind of a blend in over top of those. So like soft light is a pretty nice one. It's maybe a little bit too light, in which case I could lower the opacity. And really any blending mode that you find that works, there's no wrong answer for blending modes. I mean, really anything that you want to do is great. Sometimes add works really well, like for flames, if it's like flame, like a picture, a high res photograph of like fire on a black background, add is a really good one because it'll take away those black pixels. But as you can tell, since it's a white piece of paper, it makes it a little bit too luminescent, too bright, even at a lower opacity. Color burn I thought was okay. Multiply was good. Some of those I think also work. And then it's just some kind of a system here with the amount of opacity or blend that you want on your image. And, I can double check it. I can hit tilde and also kind of zoom in so I can see the texture. I could play it and see what it looks like, over top of the image. If it seems like it fits pretty well, then you're good to go. I kind of like the amount of dark that it's adding into some of my shadows and deepening it a little bit. So that was kind of fun. Hit tilde again to get back out of that. And the next step in this process is just to make it move, because I think texture just looks better when you can make it move on the screen. So if you have some kind of texture on there, I think that's a good way to do it. You can add just a little bit of texture to this so that it moves around. You don't have to have moving texture, but just kind of a fun way to introduce texture and the looping expressions. So I'm going to zoom in to my frames. And again, you can tell your frames because you have little 1F there. I'm going to go ahead and just move it one advanced frame and then add 90-degree turn. And that's just going to make it have this sort of like oscillating effect over top of that texture. I'll then advance it again, set it to 180. And then we'll do -90, which is all the way around, or I could add 90 to 180, which is what, 240? Basically the same. Now this is when I want it to be kind of a rotation all the way around. So at the end at this point, if it's going a full like quarter turn all the way around as it goes, at the end, I want it to start it again at 0, but that's will be right here where it is, that kind of 1 point there. And then I will go ahead and loop this. So as soon as it's going to be returning to the original frame, that would be the first frame. That's when I'm ready to loop. To be able to access your looping expressions, you're going to hold down the Option key or Alt key. If you hover over the stopwatch, it actually tells you how to do that with this little pop-up. So Option click, add or remove expression. That's what we're trying to do. When I click with that, it gives me a little pop-up window that I can add an expression to. And you can always add an expression to anything that has a stopwatch, I'm pretty sure. So I'm just going to type LOOP because that's what I want it to do. And there's actually a nice pre-built kind of coding way that you can add in multiple expressions in this sense, which I think is really, really helpful. Now, if you don't type it in right, it'll sort of say, hey, this expression error didn't work out, and it won't do the loop that you're wanting. So make sure you don't get that kind of message pop up when you're adding these in. Now, this particular loop out and loop in, these are kind of the two main kind of loops that you might want to do. A loop in means it will repeat until it hits the first frame, in which case, if I were to move these frames around, I could do a loop in expression and sort of say, this is where I want it to loop to, and then stop past this point. And if you want to see what that looks like, we'll do loop in. And then that way, when I hit enter, it should do its looping effect within that space. So I can go ahead and view this, and we'll take a look at how the loop in expression works. Let me just limit my workspace. Oops, just click there. There we go. And I'll hit space bar. And I apologize about the frame rate on Zoom. You may not be able to see it, but you should see the texture then stop at the end. Let me extend the time a little bit so we have a little bit more time to see it. Yeah, so the texture does that kind of like flash, kind of oscillate effect, and then stops because of the loop in expression. It's just looping until it hits that last frame and then stops looping. Now, vice versa, if I wanted to do the loop out expression, this one will do something different. It's essentially just going to loop after the last keyframe. So it won't loop at the beginning. And then it will continue to loop after the last keyframe. So let's see how this one works. So nothing's looping until it gets to those keyframes, and then it'll just continue looping till the full length of my composition. So looping expression, I think, is really useful because it would be crazy to have to, restructure these as we were going through. So let me move these keyframes back to the beginning here. And we'll put them on the first frame. So this will just be a constant kind of texture that I have throughout my composition. And I thought that might be just something fun to play around with. Right. So let's take a look at some of the other things that I added in this composition. We'll kind of play around with how these are set up within this space. So for my rocks, which are moving in the background, let me zoom out here and we can kind of watch the animation that I have. Oh, you know what? I actually have one that's rendered. So let's watch that instead so you guys can see it. And you can play GIFs in your web browser. So can you guys see that okay with the zoom frame rate thing? It's a little bit better than trying to watch it in After Effects. Yeah, okay, cool. So that's what I've got so far. It's a pretty basic animation. It doesn't have a whole lot of like moving parts. I haven't rotoscoped anything yet. There's definitely a few things that I want to clean up as I'm continuing to work on this, but it's pretty solid so far. I think one thing that I definitely want to add is that the smoke or the like kind of dust behind the motorbike kind of moves a little bit unnaturally, right? Like the whole cloud itself is not going to follow the bike. It would kind of trail off in the end and then sort of follow it over and then start to have another cloud in a different space. So I want to try and maybe add a little something to it. And I did have to clean this up. This is maybe like the 4th version that I rendered just to try and clean up some of the keyframes. There are a few places where the wiggle didn't quite line up for the smoke trail behind the bike. So I want to show you kind of what I did to be able to fix some of those things. So let me go back to After Effects here. Okay, so let's take a look at the rocks and we'll take a look at the smoke together. So the rocks themselves, I really wanted them to loop. And let me turn off my texture so that's not super distracting at the top here. So what I was trying to do with these rocks was trying to get them to loop, but they also start where they're already on the screen, right? So you can just take a look at these layers here towards the bottom. I also color coordinated these. I made the rocks kind of like a tan color and made like the clouds, the kind of like a teal color. And then I had like the bike, which was a different color. And then I had this null object. We'll talk about null objects as well today. So I wanted to be able to have these rocks transition and move, right? So that it starts somewhere and goes somewhere. Now, what I ended up deciding to do is that I can't use the loop expression to loop these because there's no introduction to how the rocks appear on the screen, right? So they actually move to the end here. And the way that I animated these is all at once. So if I hold the shift key, click on the top rock and click on the bottom one, you can hit P to open up the position for all of them. And then you can use the numbers, the values, in any one of these to move them all at once. So you can animate multiple objects at the same time, which I think is super useful. Let me move my keyframes over a little bit for all of these. Again, I can do it all at once. And let me just add a new keyframe as if I was going to start from somewhere else. So check this out. I've got all these layers selected. I've got position open on all of them. The stopwatch is already started to be able to animate them all together. I can just change the value. In which case, if I wanted them to start somewhere else, I can just add in that value and it changes the value for all of them at once. You could do the same thing by clicking and dragging. These layers were a little bit small for me to be able to click and drag, accurately from a distance. So I just thought that adding the value made sense. So this is a useful way to be able to animate and sort of put multiple keyframes on multiple layers at the same time. You just click on the top one, hold shift and click on the bottom one, which I think you're used to being able to control things that way. So a useful process for being able to add in multiple keyframes, and in which case, now that I have my keyframes added in, I just added a little bit of change, right? I wanted the front rock to look like it was moving a little bit faster as it's closer to the camera, making the back one move a little bit slower. So I just made the time, do you guys see the time in between these keyframes is a little bit longer in the places where I wanted to go a little bit slower. So the distance I tried to keep more or less consistent. And again, a lot of it was just, setting up my timeline so that I was just watching, one little section at a time and hitting play and playing it back and try to figure out and make sure that the timeline lined up. Now, these rocks don't have to, they can actually kind of teleport in a lot of ways. So I could, to be able to set up a looping expression with these if I wanted to, just get them to teleport. And let me show you guys what I mean by teleport when I'm creating a layer. Do you guys see this rock here? Do you see the one that's jumping? This is Beatrix rock. She needed to teleport a little bit. Do you guys see that layer? Yeah. So the way that I did this, again, it's hidden, so you don't actually see it. But again, the bike is going to continue along its path and the smoke is going to move out of the way. And if I had left that rock there underneath the smoke, you would see it right here. Do you see that keyframe there? I had to extend another one to add it in. And I just wanted to make sure that that layer was off of the composition entirely so that I could start resetting the next motion with the next set of rocks. So all I needed to do was zoom in so that there's only one keyframe difference, and that's the only difference. There's no motion between those keyframes. It just literally jumps from one position to the next position. So that's kind of what I mean by like a teleportation effect, essentially. So when I'm moving this little piece over, it just kind of jumps from one spot to the other. And I just needed to get it off the canvas so that it was not part of the composition. So that's kind of how I set up that first interaction. I was trying to set it up so that it could be looping expression, but what I figured out is that it was actually a little bit easier to be a little bit more unique in the way that these rocks work by just duplicating the layers. So that's all I did here. I just selected all the layers, copy pasted the layers. So Command C to copy, or Control C if you're on a PC, Command V to paste, and that set up a whole nother layer of positions. All right, so when I'm adding in these keyframes within these, I just had them the next set of rocks that are ready to kind of come out of the background to set these in, right? I wanted to make sure that it kind of like comes from outside of the composition. So they all start somewhere outside, and then they move similarly in the path at varying speeds to make it sure looks like, something is out, in the distance, in the depth. So it's a little bit varied within the space. And then I just also ones that needed to disappear after they were invisible in the underneath the smoke layer or the dust layer, and just have it teleport off of the canvas. So these were just a few keyframes that I set up in this space. And then I had them repeat again. And this time at the end, I needed them to be in the same position at the beginning so that I could set a looping animation. So I really just needed these to be one frame before the first frame and wherever it starts, so that as it goes with the loop, there's a seamless amount of motion within that as it continues looping. So I was going to do this with the looping expression like I just showed you a little bit ago, but this ended up just being easier and a little bit, easier to kind of understand as I was putting this together by putting those on their new layer. And it's okay to, copy paste layers and repeat actions. Okay, let's talk about hold frames. Do you guys see this little interaction here where it goes from one side of the composition that's all the way over to the left-hand side and then suddenly jumps over to the right-hand side as it repeats? So this was set up with a hold keyframe. And if you see these little keyframes here, they have like a little block on one side rather than being a solid diamonds. So they're sort of, triangles or like a home plate on a baseball field sideways. These are hold keyframes. And if you click on them on any of your keyframes and right click, it will give you the option to toggle hold keyframe. This is a keyframe that essentially means there is no movement. There will be no movement before the next keyframe on the list. So you're telling it that you want it to hold its position, completely don't move, no motion in that position that you're animating in this case, the position property. I'm going to go ahead and drag this over, and it will only move after it hits the next space, the next keyframe in the series. So this is a great way to also make things teleport. You're sort of like taking and reusing the same object and just telling it to be somewhere else. In this case, this is really useful if you're trying to get something to make it look like it moves in a particular direction so that I can reuse the same object rather than having to make a copy. So this would maybe another way that I could have done that initial thing, but I definitely want to show you how to copy things and include that in part of my workflow here. So this one's really, really useful. I highly recommend using hold keyframes. Again, to access it, just any keyframes, multiple keyframes. If you want to do it to a whole bunch of keyframes at the same time, you can just right click and then choose toggle hold keyframe, and that'll just flip them to be all kind of the same toggle hold keyframe in that sense. So that's a really useful process, I think, a useful one, especially if you're trying to get things to move from one space to the other. All right, so that was kind of the rocks. Any questions about the rocks so far, guys? I'll try to open up my Zoom screen so I can see you. Guys good? Cool, helpful, okay. Right on. So let's talk about the smoke thing next, and then we'll look at how we set up a swerve. So I have multiple parented objects in this sense. I try to get my parented objects with my clouds to sort of follow the same direction. And let me maybe shrink the amount of layers that we have to look at with my shy guy in this case. So we're going to look at these ones. These are kind of the next target ones. Those other layers are still there, right? They're just hidden underneath the shy guy so that we don't have to look at those and kind of fill up the screen with lots of layers that we're not paying attention to. So these are all layered in a particular order. I wanted to make sure that this lined up with the back wheel of the bike as it's continuing. And as you could tell, these two pieces are actually duplicates to try and create kind of a shadow underneath the bike. And that was not something that I created in my original illustration. This is actually a piece of the same shadow that I created and then just duplicated it and used a mask to show only underneath the bike, and then just parented it to the bike, except for a little section. So let's talk about the shadow underneath the bike. Again, it's the same copy of this dust cloud. I just wanted to add another shadow under the bike. So here's the dusty, the shadow number 2. I added a mask to it by using my pen tool. You can add a mask to anything by using your pen tool or shape layer whenever you have that layer selected, and just click to add a mask. You can have as many masks on a layer as you want. So there's now 2 masks on that layer, right? So again, pen tool, just click when you have that layer selected to add a mask. You can also go to the layer and choose a mask and new mask if you want to do it that way. If for some reason it doesn't let you add a mask natively, that's another way to do it. Just choose the layer and then layer, mask, new mask. So the masks are really useful because it's basically the same shape layer. I just moved it in a position where that shadow would take up that entire space, and then just added in kind of the shape of the shadow underneath the bike that I wanted. And this is kind of like just a loose shadow. It just follows. There's no motion to it. It's not terribly complicated at this point. It could be much more detailed, right? If I wanted to spend a little bit more time making the kind of silhouette of the character, I think that would be fun. So those are things that I could do in the future as I'm still working on this project. I did want to make it look like the bike jumps in one space. So I animated the mask. And animate the mask, you can use this section here where it says mask path. You just hit the stopwatch just like any other feature. And then when you change the shape of the mask, in this case, I just moved all of the points together with just the selection tool. You can move it around wherever you want it to go, and then change that and add sort of just a little motion to that. So it looks like it hops in one space. I didn't find a lot of other spaces where it needed to do that hopping. So there was just one there. Kind of a fun motion, I thought. So that was just a duplicated feature or kind of layer. This one took me a little bit of time. And do you guys see all these keyframe points? Don't worry, this is not really complicated. It actually is just a little bit of work of tediousness. What I found when I tried to parent this to the swerve, and I'll show you what I'm talking about when I add in my swerve, but just you guys see how there's kind of like a motion to the bike? Besides the bike bouncing up and down periodically, there's a little bit of a swerve motion to it. So the swerve motion is something that I added to on a null object. And the reason I did that is because the bike itself is all parented to the wheel. And I could have tried to sort of like make the big white bike wheel here kind of add in a lot of motion to it. But since I am having a looping expression on the bounce that I added in, so I just added some little keyframes that make it kind of just do like this, just up and down. So you can ignore the swerve for a second. That's just the bounce of this wheel. And then I added a looping expression to this to just sort of show that there's a loop, so that it starts right at the end of this keyframe. It starts at the beginning and just loops all the way through. So there's just a little nice bounce to it. Now I couldn't really control the position while also making it bounce at the same time. That would have been too many trying things on the same layer. And that's when null objects become really, really handy. Now, a null object is just kind of a strange name for an empty layer. It has nothing on it. It has its own anchor point, and there's not really any scale or position to it necessarily. It's just the anchor point and where the position of the anchor point is. So you can add these if you go to the layer menu at the top and just choose new null object. So it's right here in this menu. This particular item is really useful because you can just animate, now I can take the parented objects of the bike. I made all of the bike objects parent to the big wheel, and then I made the big wheel follow the swerve. So the swerve is the name of the null object. The object or the position of these points on this particular bouncing is on the bike wheel, which also still animates that, but then also follows this null object. And so this null object, I just added some motion in. I added a little easing. So do you guys see these keyframes that look like hourglasses or sort of time things? You can right click to add in easing. Easing just makes it speed up at the beginning or slow down at the beginning and sort of be slower in the middle or slower at the ends. And you can just do this by right clicking, go to keyframe assistant and choose easy ease. Now, when you choose easy ease, what it is actually changing is the motion graph. So you guys remember the motion graph for speed? It's adding a little bit of transition here. See how in this case, it's going to go really fast in the middle and slow at the beginning. So here's the speed distance over time, right? As I move this over, it's going really slow here. As it slopes up, it will go really, really fast and then slow down again. So I'm just trying to show this motion between these two positions. I know this looks really complicated, but most of this was just added in with easing, and a couple of them I went into the speed graph and kind of pulled on the handlebars to just edit that just a little bit. Now this motion is not particularly complicated. Most of this motion I did by just rotating the bike slightly or stretching it in one direction. I don't think that looks particularly realistic, but from a distance, I think it sells the idea okay. There's an opportunity here where I can actually add in some rotoscoping things too, right? So I could add in a couple layers that only exist and appear when the bike is turning. So if I wanted to show a little bit more of an angle or change the position of the handlebars and things like that, I could go in and add a tiny bit of detail at the same time as the bike is kind of changing position to make it look like it's kind of going around the canvas. So these were just position, scale, and rotation, just a tiny bit. There wasn't a whole lot of change there. I think rotation only goes up to about 10-degree difference in a couple places to make it look like it just kind of hops and turns, like someone's leaning with the bike. That was kind of the idea. The position is the only one that I added any kind of easing to. And the easing, again, just makes it speed up in the center or slow down in the center and speed up at the ends, depending on which you'd like to choose. So useful one to check out. I really highly recommend at least looking at easing if you haven't already. It's a useful process. All right, so the null object was added in there. Now, when I was adding in the clouds, I wanted the clouds to follow the bike, but I also felt like it was a little unrealistic to try and parent the cloud. These clouds kind of follow the bike. This one follows the bike, which is fine. But this one, because it wiggles so much, the following the bike wasn't as helpful. And because it wiggles on the end, it kind of needs to be a little bit more positioned. So I just spent, I don't know, 20 minutes maybe, and I made a few keyframes so that I could just animate this cloud along with the bike as it moves from the back wheel. So just every once in a while, I would add a keyframe to it lined up, and then I would scrub back through or play it until I could find any errors where this position of this kind of cloud doesn't line up with the back wheel. So it was just trying to find the spaces where it doesn't line up and then add a keyframe. So it ended up looking kind of like this, but a lot of it's just, okay, well, it doesn't quite line up here when I zoom in really close. So if I wanted to fix this, just select my move tool and click and drag to add another keyframe until that little like kind of wave lines up at the back wheel on the point at the end. And that was it, really. I mean, most of these were just kind of like trying to make sure that it lined up at that space. There were a few places where it had to jump around a little bit more because it was trying to follow the bounce of the bike as it was making its way through that space. And that was about it. One more thing that I thought was really useful with this is there is a feature here on your layers panel. Do you guys see the section right next to the shy guy here? This one is really useful. This one actually makes it continuously raster your layers, which means if you have vector layers like we do in Illustrator, these ones will make it so it's crisp if you change the scale. So because I was editing the scale property, and in some places it's got 150% scale on some items, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't getting pixelated when I was changing the scale. This button, this column right here that looks like a star, is the one that will continuously raster your layers as you change the scale. So that was really useful. So then I ended up going ahead and rendering this. And let me just show you how to render these things. and then we'll have some time to kind of talk about where you are with your projects as well. So when I'm ready to render this, I want to make sure that my timeline extends the full length for my work area. If for some reason it's smaller, it will only render the space that you have here for this particular item. So if I have it at 2 seconds, it will only render 2 seconds. This needs to be fully expanded all the way through. If I go to the composition here and let's see, file and export, add to Adobe Media Encoder, that's the one that we want to choose here. If you just wait a second, it'll open up the media encoder and then add that in. Underwrite this section. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to switch over to media encoder. So here's the media encoder. This is one that I rendered. I just sort of left it open. You can choose the save location here. If you change this section instead of H.264, you can choose from the drop-down list animated GIF. So then it will just save it as an animated GIF that you can then use and sort of put into a web browser to view. I think if you're on a Mac, you just click on the file and hit spacebar to open it, and it'll play that way as well. So you can just do that and then hit play. When you do that, it'll render that as a GIF for you, which is awesome.